On the morning of the 25th of February, 1991, two American pilots flew out over the Iraqi desert in the slowest, ugliest combat jet in the United States Air Force. By the time they landed and refueled and flew again and landed and flew a third time, they would be credited with 23 Iraqi tanks. 2 men, 1 day. 23 tanks. In an airplane the Air Force had spent years treating like something it was a little embarrassed to own. This is not really a story about a dogfight. It is barely a story about a battle. It is a story about two machines that went to the same war to do the same brutal job, killing tanks, and came home with two completely different reputations. One of them got the glory. It fired the first shots of the entire war, deep inside enemy territory, in the dark, in a strike so clean it has been studied ever since. That machine was the AH-64 Apache, and it earned every bit of its fame. The other one came home shot full of holes, flew thousands of missions nobody made a movie about, was credited with more tanks killed than anything else in the sky, and cost a fraction of the price. That one was the A-10 Thunderbolt. Almost nobody called it that. They called it the Warthog. Here is the part almost no one tells you. The plane that did the heaviest tank killing of the war was the one the Air Force never wanted to build, never wanted to keep, and never put on a recruiting poster. To understand why, you have to go back almost 20 years before that desert morning to a fight inside the Pentagon over what a tank-killing airplane should even be. In the late 1960s, the Air Force had a problem it did not enjoy admitting. In the skies over Vietnam, the planes asked to fly low and protect troops on the ground were getting torn apart. The old propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raider was tough and beloved. Pilots called it the Spad, and it could loiter over a firefight far longer than any fast jet. But it was slow, and it burned, and ground fire chewed it up. Across the war, more than 250 Sky Raiders were lost, a great many of them to the guns of the men they were trying to fight. Every plane that went down was the same lesson, written again in fire. The men on the ground needed something that could come in low, take a beating, and stay over the battlefield long enough to actually matter. And the thing built to do that needed to survive being shot, because over a real battlefield, it was going to be. There was a second pressure too, and it came from inside the Army. The Army had watched the close air support job go badly, and had started building its own answer, an attack helicopter that could kill tanks without waiting on the Air Force at all. To the Air Force, that was a threat. If the Army could do close air support on its own, the Air Force might lose the mission entirely, so the choice became simple. Build a real dedicated tank killer, or watch the job walk out the door. So the Air Force launched a program called AX. The idea was almost insulting to fast jet culture. Build a plane that did not go fast. Build a plane that did not fly high. Build a plane that could absorb punishment and keep flying. And build it cheap. The original design goal was a flyaway price of around $1.5 million in the money of that era. They were not chasing a thoroughbred. They were chasing a workhorse. And here is a detail worth holding on to, because it explains the whole rest of the story. Cheap was not an accident. Cheap was a written requirement. They picked a dollar number first and made the airplane fit inside it. That is the opposite of how almost every glamorous weapon ever gets built. Two companies built prototypes for a fly-off. Fairchild Republic built the YA-10. Northrop built the YA-9. And the two looked nothing alike. The Northrop design was the conventional-looking one, sleek, with its engines tucked neatly under the wing roots. The Fairchild design was the strange one, with its engines bolted high on the back and a twin tail. Through 1972, the two aircraft were flown head-to-head in the desert, shot at the same targets, dragged through the same low passes. The Fairchild plane handled better down low, sat steadier as a gun platform, and hid its engines from ground fire behind the wing and tail. In January of 1973, the Air Force picked the YA-10. It entered service in 1977. And what they built was strange all the way through. The whole airplane was designed around a gun. The GAU-8 Avenger is a 7-barrel 30mm cannon. The barrels spin like the chambers of a giant revolver, each one firing in turn as it comes around, which is the only way a gun can throw shells that fast without tearing itself apart. And it is fast. Depending on the setting, it spits somewhere between 2,100 and 4,200 rounds a minute. The shells themselves are the size of milk bottles, tipped with depleted uranium, a metal so dense and so hard it punches through armor and then keeps burning on the way in. The cannon is so enormous the airplane was essentially built behind it. The nose wheel had to be shoved off to one side just to make room, because the gun sits dead on the center line so the recoil does not twist the plane in a turn. And that recoil is its own legend. When the Warthog fires, the gun pushes back against the airframe with thousands of pounds of force, enough that, fired in a long burst, it can actually slow the whole airplane down in the air. Pilots learn to fire in short taps, a second or less, not because the gun could not handle more, but because the plane only carries so many rounds, and you do not waste them. But here is the thing the brochure never leads with, and it is the most important mechanical fact in this whole video. That famous gun did not kill most of the tanks. The missile did. Slung under the wings was the Maverick, a guided rocket with a seeker in its nose that locks onto a target and flies itself in while the pilot turns away. The gun got the legend, and the nickname, and the noise. The Maverick got the armor. Hold that, because it comes back. Then they wrapped the pilot in a tub of titanium, roughly 1,200 pounds of it, formed into a bathtub around the cockpit, built to shrug off rounds that would kill any other pilot in the sky. The two engines were mounted high and far apart, so a hit that killed one could not easily kill the other. The fuel tanks were filled with foam, so they would not explode when punctured. And the flight controls had a manual backup, a system of cables and rods, so that even with every drop of hydraulic fluid shot out of the airplane, the pilot could still wrestle it home by hand. Engineers called it get-home capability, and it was a literal design goal, written down, tested for. This was a machine built around a single grim assumption: it will get hit. Build it to come home anyway. Now, while the Air Force was reluctantly building its ugly tank killer, the Army was finishing the very thing that had scared the Air Force in the first place. The Army had wanted a real attack helicopter for years. An earlier program, the AH-64 Cheyenne, had been cancelled in 1972 after years of trouble and cost overruns. So the Army started fresh with a new program for an advanced attack helicopter. Two prototypes competed. Hughes built one, Bell built another. The Army chose the Hughes design, and after a long development, it entered Army service in 1986 as the AH-64 Apache. And the Apache was everything the Warthog was not. It was sleek where the A-10 was blunt. It was packed with technology. It could carry up to 16 Hellfire missiles. It had a 30mm chain gun slaved to a sight built into the pilot's helmet, so the gun looked wherever the pilot looked, and it had a day and night targeting system that let it hunt in total darkness. It was, on paper, one of the most advanced killing machines ever flown, and it carried a price tag to match, many times what a Warthog cost. Where the A-10 was built to a dollar number, the Apache was built to a capability, and you paid whatever that capability cost. So you had two machines born from the same argument, pointed at the same enemy. One cheap, ugly, and slow, one expensive, sleek, and brilliant. And in January of 1991, both of them went to war over Iraq. The Apache went first. And what it did is genuinely one of the great opening moves in modern military history. At 38 minutes past 2 in the morning on the 17th of January, 1991, 8 Apaches crossed into Iraq. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody, and because the Apaches of that era did not carry their own satellite navigation, they were guided in by Air Force MH-53 Pave-Low helicopters that did. The Pave-Lows had terrain-following radar and satellite navigation. The Apaches had the missiles. The plan married the two. There was even a backup Apache flying along in case one dropped out, and a Black Hawk trailing behind in case anyone got shot down and needed pulling out of the sand. The whole formation flew at night, just a few dozen feet off the desert floor, slow and low, to slip in under the radar that was hunting for exactly this. Their target was 2 Iraqi early warning radar sites deep inside the border. Those radars were the eyes of the Iraqi air defense network. They were the difference between Iraq seeing the war coming and Iraq being blind. Behind these 8 helicopters a few hundred miles back, the largest air armada assembled since the Second World War was already in the air. Thousands of jets headed for Baghdad. If those 2 radar sites stayed up, the Iraqis would see that wave coming and have minutes to react, to scramble fighters, to wake up the missile batteries. If the radars went down, a blind spot would open in the wall, a corridor about 20 miles wide, and the entire air war could pour through it untouched. 2 buildings. The whole opening night hinged on 2 buildings. The helicopters crept the last stretch in the dark. When they reached their firing points, a pilot in the formation made the call. The phrase he used was, "Party in 10." It meant the Hellfires were already in the air, and the targets had 10 seconds left. 10 seconds later, they struck. Both radar sites were torn apart, and the destruction was done in roughly 4 minutes. The blind spot opened right on schedule, just over 20 minutes before the main attack. The wall had a hole in it. The armada poured through. I want to be completely clear about this, because it matters. That strike was the Apache at its absolute best, and it is something the A-10 simply could not have done. A slow, fixed-wing jet cannot creep through the dark at 50 feet, hang back at a firing point, and put missiles precisely onto 2 specific buildings deep inside enemy territory before anyone even knows a war has started. That mission belonged to the helicopter, and the Apache earned every word of praise it got for flying it. The men who flew it waited decades for the medals, and they had earned those too. But here is the detail that gets lost under all that glory. That night was the Apache's headline. It was not the bulk of the war's tank killing, and when you pull the 2 machines side by side over the whole campaign, the story bends hard. Because while the Apache flew its opening strike and then largely waited for the ground war, the Warthog went to work and did not stop. If you are finding this story worth your time, take 1 second to subscribe. This channel lives on the machines history overlooked, and there are a lot more of them coming. So here is where things get relentless, because relentless is the only word for what the A-10 did next. While the headlines were still busy with the opening night, the Warthogs were already flying, and they kept flying, day after day, for the better part of 6 weeks. The numbers, once you lay them out, are hard to argue with. Roughly 132 A-10s deployed to the Gulf. Over the 40-day air war, they flew on the order of 8,100 strike sorties. That was the highest sortie rate of any Air Force aircraft in the war. And they did it while staying ready. The A-10 force posted a mission-capable rate of about 95.7%, which means almost every Warthog sitting on the ramp was good to fly almost every day. The desert sand that fouled finer machines just did not bother it much. It was built blunt on purpose, and blunt held up. Hold that number in your head, because the Apache's experience in the same desert was about to go very differently. A lot of the killing happened at night, and the way they did it is one of the cleverest field improvisations of the whole war. The A-10s of that era did not have a proper night vision targeting camera built in, but the Maverick missile did. Its seeker was an infrared camera, meant to lock onto the heat of an engine. So pilots started using the missile's own seeker as a night scope. A tank parked in the cold desert holds the day's heat and glows in infrared like a coal. The pilots would scan the dark ground through the missile's eye, find a glowing shape, confirm it was armor, and fire. They called the whole tactic tank plinking, picking off vehicles one by one in the dark, and on some nights the desert lit up with it. It was a missile being used as a flashlight to aim itself. Nobody designed it to work that way. The crews figured it out and ran with it. Now, about the kills. I am going to say this plainly, and then I'm going to say it again later, because it is the most honest part of this whole story. Every one of these numbers is a wartime credit, not a confirmed, counted, verified kill. After the war, the people whose job it was to check found that a great many Gulf War weapon claims were overstated, and in a lot of cases simply could not be verified at all. So when I say a number, hear the word credited in front of it, every time. With that said, across the war, the A-10 force was credited with 987 tanks, 926 artillery pieces, 1,355 other combat vehicles. And here is that detail again, the one people get wrong all the time. Most of those armor kills did not come from that enormous cannon. They came from the Maverick, fired from under the wing. The A-10 fired roughly 9 out of every 10 Mavericks launched in the entire war. The gun got the legend. The missile got the tanks. I mean, think about that for a second. The most famous gun in the sky, and its own airplane killed more armor with a rocket. By comparison, the Apache force was credited with 278 tanks, plus around 900 other targets, across roughly 650 sorties. That is a real contribution and a serious record, and I am not going to wave it away. But set it next to the Warthogs, and the gap is plain. Credited with 987 tanks against 278. That is where the 3-to-1 in the headline comes from. It is a ratio of credits, and you should hold it loosely. But it is the number the official tallies produced. There was one stretch where the ground war and the air war collided, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is the closest thing this story has to a set-piece battle. In the last days of January, before the big ground push, the Iraqis tried a move of their own. They sent armor south and seized the little Saudi coastal town of Kavji. It was the one time in the war Iraq took ground on the offensive, and it walked right into the thing the coalition did best. Spotters found the columns out in the open, and the air came down on them. Warthogs and other aircraft worked the Iraqi armor in the open desert, broke the advance apart, and turned an attack into a retreat. It was a preview of the whole ground war in miniature. Out in the open, against aircraft that owned the sky, mass tanks were not a weapon. They were targets. And then there is the part the cannon and the Maverick still cannot quite explain. Twice, in that war, the Warthog did something a tank killer is not supposed to be able to do. It shot down an aircraft. On the 6th of February, an A-10 pilot caught an Iraqi helicopter low over the desert. He could not get a missile to lock, because the target was hugging the ground and would not stand out. So he did the only thing a Warthog pilot can really do in that spot. He pointed the entire airplane at it and fired the cannon. At that fire rate, a 1-second burst is a wall of depleted uranium, and the helicopter simply came apart in the air. The pilot earned the nickname Chopper Popper. 9 days later, on the 15th of February, another A-10 downed a second helicopter, an Mi-8, the same brute way, a plane built to kill tanks, scoring air-to-air kills with a gun meant for armor. That is not in the brochure for any fast jet ever built. So why, if the cheap plane was doing all this, does the expensive one get remembered as the star? Part of the answer is the radar strike. That opening night was cinematic, and cinematic is what gets remembered. Part of it is simply that the Apache looked the part, and the Warthog did not. One was built for a recruiting poster, the other was built to come home ugly. But part of it is something harder, and to its credit, the record is honest about it. The desert was brutal on the Apache. The same blowing sand the A-10 shrugged off got into everything the helicopter depended on. The official review afterward found the Apache's 30mm gun system was the most failure-prone thing it carried. On one well-known mission, an entire formation of Apaches went in to attack, and the gun system failed across the force, so they could not bring that weapon to bear the way they were supposed to. The Hellfire missiles and the night vision sights degraded in the blowing sand and the smoke from burning oil. Spare parts ran short, and crews were reduced to pulling pieces off some helicopters just to keep others flying. In that desert, the Apache's mission-capable rate fell to somewhere around 30%. Put that next to the Warthog's 95. The brilliant, expensive machine struggled to stay in the air. The cheap, ugly one almost never left the fight. And somehow that gets left out of the story. But I promised you honesty, and honesty cuts both ways here, so I am going to take some shine off the Warthog too. That tiny loss rate, 6 A-10s lost in the whole war, 4 of them to surface-to-air missiles, a loss rate of well under 1 in 1,000 sorties, is not the full picture. Around the middle of February, after damaged Warthogs kept limping home from the heaviest, most defended Republican Guard targets, the air commander made a call. He pulled the A-10s off those targets and handed them to faster jets. So the Warthog did not survive the exact same fight the toughest defenses could throw at it. Part of the reason it came home so often is that, At the worst moment, against the worst air defenses, it was taken off the worst job and given the easier targets. That is not a knock on the airplane. The plane did exactly what it was built to do, which was absorb hits and fly home, and it did it so visibly that the brass decided it was too valuable to keep grinding against the heaviest guns. But it is the truth, and you deserve it straight. And here is the biggest piece of honesty of all, the one that should make you suspicious of every number in this video, mine included. The air war did not destroy the Iraqi army the way the press conferences claimed. When the dust settled, analysts went back and counted, and they found that more than 7 in 10 of the Republican Guard's tanks had actually survived the entire air campaign. Read that again. The most lopsided air war in history, weeks of round-the-clock bombing, and most of the best Iraqi tanks rolled away intact. The crews had learned fast. They slept away from their vehicles, so a strike on the tank would not kill the men. They scattered the tanks and dug them in and threw decoys around. A burning tank in a gun camera photograph is not always a dead crew, and a claimed kill is not always a kill. The real tallies were almost certainly lower than the headline numbers, for both machines, by a lot, so strip all of it down. Strip away the overstated counts, and the desert myth, and the recruiting poster glamour. What are you actually left with? You are left with this. The Apache fired the first shots of the war in a night strike the Warthog could never have flown, and it deserves that honor without an asterisk. And the A-10, the plane the Air Force kept trying not to love, flew the most missions, stayed ready when the sand grounded everything sleeker than it, was credited with far more armor than anything else over that desert, turned a missile seeker into a night scope to hunt tanks in the dark, scored kills with its gun that no fast jet ever managed, and came home flying with damage that would have dropped almost anything else in the sky, at a fraction of the price. And the two of them never dueled. Let me be just as clear about that as I was about the radar strike. The A-10 and the Apache never faced each other, and they did not even fight the same fight on the same clock. The Warthog flew a 40-day air war. The Apache flew the opening strike, and then much of the 100-hour ground war. This is not a clean head-to-head, and anyone who sells it to you as one is lying to you. The fair claim is narrower, and it is still devastating. Credited with far more armor, at a fraction of the cost, the cheap jet did the long, ugly bulk of the tank killing, while the famous one took the bow. The math, laid side by side, is hard to argue with. The glory went to the machine on the poster. The killing, the long, ugly grind of it, went to the machine nobody wanted to build. That is the whole story of the Warthog in one line. It was never supposed to be loved, it was only supposed to work, and it did. If you want the next story like this one, the overlooked machine that quietly outworked the famous one, the video on screen is where to go next.